Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Pebbles Turbyville. I'm the CEO of Horses and Humans Research Foundation. And just in case you don't know about us, we like to say we're HHRF to make it short, do the acronym. We're all about horses and human interaction, exploring it, educating others about the value of the relationship and the connection. And we also support research that helps both to thrive. So, welcome. And I am going to turn it over now to Cheryl, one of our board members, who will introduce our speaker.
Hey guys, I'm happy to be here with you tonight. So we have Dr. Sabrina Schell, who's going to be sharing her dissertation findings. She completed this research at Capella University and looked at how licensed counselors experience the Therapeutic Alliance in equine-assisted counseling. I'll tell you a funny story, which is a plug for always checking your research. I always get emails daily that, have keywords from Google Scholar. And so I go in and check and see which ones I'm interested. And that's how I saw Sabrina's dissertation. And I was so excited about the topic. I emailed her right away and I was like, would you like to set up a meeting? I want to tell you all about HHRF. And that's kind of how this webinar came to be. So sometimes we do these silly things that we don't think pan out to anything, but sometimes they do. Um, and I'm really excited to hear more about her research, and I hope you guys are too. I will be, like Pebble said, moderating the chat. And so if you have questions, please put them in there. It may be something that's easier to unmute once we start talking back and forth, but when we have a break or if it really pertains to what we're talking about and there's a good pause, I will let Sabrina know that there is a question. And if it's something that's more suitable towards the end, like you can put that in the chat too, and we can have some time at the end for a little Q&A as well. So with all that, Sabrina, you have the stage and you can get started and share your screen when you're ready.
All right. Well, thank you, Cheryl. Hey everyone, I'm Sabrina. I'm super excited to be with you guys this evening and to share a little bit about my dissertation. That was really fun to do, and I think I learned a few things that were really surprising, and I'm very excited to like get it out in the community, like some of those findings. Um, I'm gonna start sharing my screen if I can still do it. All right. Is that is that correct?
Looks great.
Do we see the okay, good. Great. I already told Cheryl I'm like not the best with technology. Um, okay, and yeah, like she said, if there's any questions in between, I'm happy. I don't need to like ramble on the whole time. If there's any discussion points or any questions, do feel free to put that in the chat or let us know. So to start a little bit about me, I'm a counselor and I specialize mostly in medical trauma. And so that goes from diagnosing it for forensic cases to preventing it in pre-medical screening to treating it mostly with cancer survivors and burnout, people with chronic illness, those kind of things. And so in the realm of trauma treatment, I have worked a lot with equine-assisted psychotherapy. I'm one of those horse girls that, like, was like super into ponies her whole life. And so it kind of just like naturally came together and made a lot of sense to me from the get-go. And then when I started my PhD and I had to pick a topic, it was pretty easy. I was gonna do something with horses, obviously. Um, and one of the big things that sort of like always really was something that was like really interesting to me was the fact that it's so special in terms of like the relationship dynamics, right? Like especially with the relationship dynamics that we have with the horses that we work with. Um, it's so unique in a way that like a lot of us have sort of like relationships to our horses that are, like similar to our dogs or kids. And it's like, like it's working with your family member almost in a session, right? Like working with your fur baby. And I was very interested in um, how that played out in terms of the therapeutic alliance with the client, and if there's any sort of anything that's special about that. And so that's how I chose my topic. Did that? Yes. So to just set the stage a little bit, equine-assisted counseling, I defined for this particular dissertation, really as like the straight up, like on the ground psychotherapy interactions, no writing. So think your typical models like, I don't know, IGALA or natural lifemanship, that kind of stage. And in terms of the therapeutic alliance, I chose to define that after Edward Borden. That is sort of like the most typical way it is defined in the literature. And he sort of defined, or he identified three main aspects of the therapeutic alliance as like the three parts that make up the alliance between the client and the counselor. And that would be the shared goals, shared tasks, and a shared bond. And you'll see later that's sort of like how I structured certain questions and everything. So when we look at the relationship dynamics in equine-assisted sessions, the most obvious thing is that we're going from like a dyad where it's like a two-way, like we have the counselor and the client, and it's just like a dynamic between those two. And now with equine, we're going to a triangle, right, where we have basically three different individual relationships: the one between the counselor and the horse, the one between the counselor and the client and the horse. And in looking into the literature, I was really interested in what are sort of like the individual aspects there. And again, the counselor-client relationship, there was a lot there in terms of like the therapeutic alliance and how important it is. There's a lot of really good research out there, also based on Edward Borden's work, that really sort of like makes it very clear that like the therapeutic alliance is one of the most important aspects of treatment outcome and treatment success in psychotherapy. When it comes to the counselor and the horse, the ACA actually has a white paper on standards for animal-assisted counseling, and part of that is that they state that it is really, really important for the counselor to have an awareness of like what their relationship with the animal that they're working with is and what their knowledge base is. And then in terms of the horse and the client, obviously we have all the different like the models of equine-assisted psychotherapy. Like you have sort of like the bigger like certifying bodies like IGALA, PATH, and they all have their different models. What I could not find, and that sort of like became the research question, was what the overlap is, right? So like how do those like three individual relationships from this triangle, how do they like relate to each other, right? Like how do they like this relationship dynamic, how does it, how does it influence each other? And there was really very, very little research. I think I found like 2 articles that sort of like didn't focus on it as like the main thing, but it was sort of like a little statement thrown out somewhere in like the appendix. Like it was like really like there was really not a lot there. And I figured, like given how important the therapeutic alliance clearly is, stated in the literature, in terms of the outcomes of treatment, um, wouldn't it be nice to really understand it a little better, um, in this sort of special circumstance? And so the research question sort of became, how do counselors experience the therapeutic alliance in equine-assisted counseling in this like special environment? So in terms of the methodology, I picked a generic qualitative inquiry. So part of that was mostly because it was a dissertation, right? Like I didn't have, um, unfortunately, like with dissertations, you probably know that like they don't let you do like mixed methods or like anything cool. They don't, like they really hold you down a little. It's not well. I think it was a good start. It was a really good start to sort of like get a little bit a lay of the land in terms of like what counselors even like think, like where therapists are at in terms of like their thoughts. And I'm definitely looking into potentially doing some more research on that is a little more pointed and maybe like a little bit more like mixed methods, a bigger pool of participants. Yeah, I ended up with 8 participants. And they had anywhere from like, I think 5 to 20 years of experience in equine-assisted psychotherapy. And the demographics, can see here, it was all women, most of them white, most of them sort of like middle age. Of course, in the dissertation defense, it was like, this is a limitation. And I'm like, actually, this kind of reflects our that kind of reflects sort of like the population that does this work. But yeah, I would definitely love to have like a bigger pool and look into that a little more. So some of the outcomes. One of the themes that clearly came through in this whole thing was the relationship work prior to counseling sessions. Something that pretty much all the participants were talking about was this concept of their own relationship with the horse and how that had to be built before any client even entered the arena, right? And not like 5 minutes before, but like a lot of the counselors that participated, and that really reflected also like my experience in general over the last years, were really into their horses. Like most of them owned the horses that they work with. Most of them were very knowledgeable in their horsemanship skills. They really had a very solid sort of like trust-based relationship with their horses. And they thought that was also like very important. That wasn't just something that, like they like to have, but they also thought that was like very important in terms of their work as therapists with the horses. I think I only had like one participant that did not own the horses that they worked with. But that participant was actually using strictly the EGALA model, and they had an ES who's like an equine specialist who owned the horses and had that special relationship, and they kind of like basically like outsourced that relationship, but it was still part of it, right? So like all of them had that need for understanding the horse, and a lot of it was not just about sort of like clinical skills, but also, just like safety issues. It was about like planning for the session and understanding your horse in terms of like what do they have to offer? What does the client need? Like, where's like the best match in terms of like personality or what you can get out of the session. Yeah, so that relationship work was something that all of them were very, very strong on. And yeah, that was I thought one of the things that really like makes this feel so special, right? Because I don't really know any other counseling modality where you have to prepare in that way. Yeah, okay, some of them you have to like prepare your materials or whatever, but this is really the only model where you have to have an authentic relationship and where you really bring something from yourself, like an emotional component from yourself, into it. Um, Another theme was relationship-based learning, and I can probably skip that for this group, to be honest. But that was sort of like I described it in my dissertation defense to like all the like non-horsey therapists, as you know, like this is what you would probably hear from anyone who is using equine-assisted therapy. This is like the typical language that we all kind of use in terms of like how like what the mechanism is, like why it works, right? And that was very like closely aligned with the literature as well. And that was really all about sort of like the relationship between the horse and the client and the sort of like projecting onto the horse and like building a relationship, building mindfulness skills, practicing communication, being authentic, like feeling like the trust and um, that was very closely aligned sort of like with the literature. So up until there, like there was like nothing too surprising. It made perfect sense. It was very aligned with sort of like what I had experienced or what is sort of like the usual way for all of us to like describe this work. Um, the only thing that was sort of like a little bit of an aha moment was this like asynchronous aspect of building a therapeutic alliance, because of like that sort of like because it was like it was described almost like as a two-step process, right? So the first step is the alliance between the counselor and the horse is established first, and then the alliance between the client and the horse and counselor is established sort of like as a secondary relationship. Um, and that I thought was very interesting in terms of how we teach this because it is so different in that way, and I think it makes a lot of sense to like really like dig into when we train counselors that want to use this, like what do we know about their attachment style, about their horse knowledge, right? Like about all these things that are sort of like part of this precursor relationship between counselor and horse that then has an impact on the therapeutic relationship with the clients. Um, and then the third theme was really interesting because so remember we used Borden as like the therapeutic framework, and Borden's three aspects were like the goals, the tasks, and the bond. And one of the things that was like that was very interesting, um, all participants were in total agreement about how that looks, how goals and tasks look in equine-assisted sessions versus sort of like your regular office one-on-one sessions. And all of them said that the goals are formed the exact same way, right? So like your treatment goals are formed no matter what, like if you're doing like work in the office, or if you're doing work with horses, or if you're doing some sort of other work, like the way you form your treatment goals always kind of like stays the same. And they were all in agreement with that. And they were also all in agreement that the individual session tasks were completely different in equine-assisted sessions versus like other modalities, especially just in the office, right? They all said that it is completely different to, you have to pivot a lot more. There are a lot of like sort of like those like unique aspects about how you build a task. You have to be a lot more flexible, and that like the experience with the horse is a lot more well, it sort of like adds something where the individual tasks are more flexible, I guess. That was sort of like the main point. But they were all in agreement about that. They were all in agreement, like goals the same, tasks very different. And then I asked about the third aspect of the theory, and that was the bond. And in terms of the bond, I found that there were basically like two groups. So when I looked at the interview data from all participants, it was pretty much like a 50-50 split in terms of like how they defined the bond, like how they identified what they saw as sort of like the primary bond in the session. And I kind of called that like guiding the process versus like guarding the space. So in terms of guiding, like the half that sort of like subscribed to that specific paradigm, they were sort of like actively using specific like techniques, or had sort of like a model that they worked from, where they were using activities with the horse to guide a specific process. Like they had a goal in mind of like, for example, like we're going to practice mindfulness through brushing. Here's the brush. This is what we're going to do, right? And they were sort of like guiding the clients through it. And that's how they described their sessions. And for those guides, the bond in our triangle, in terms of the therapeutic alliance, the primary bond was still between the client and the counselor, right? So when I asked them all the questions I had about therapeutic alliance, they answered it very traditionally of like, like the therapeutic alliance is between the counselor and the client, and we use the horse as sort of like a medium, right? And so they saw that relationship still as like the primary relationship. And then the other half was describing the whole setup in a completely different way. The other half, the guiding the space people, they sort of saw the whole purpose of equine-assisted sessions as sort of like them stepping out of it, them stepping away, and letting the client have an experience with the horses. And they prioritize the bond between the horse and the client over any bond that they had themselves with the client or the horse. And they saw the therapeutic alliance in this context as the therapeutic alliance between the horse and the client, rather than the counselor and the client. So in terms of that triangle, like these two groups really saw different sides of the triangle as like the main therapeutic alliance, and the strongest bond. Um, so that was interesting because it just showed two completely different philosophical understandings of like what the therapeutic alliance even is in equine assisted counseling, um, which I thought was interesting because I hadn't really thought about it in that way. Um, but it would be interesting to see different models sort of like categorized in that way, right? Like which ones are sort of like guiding the process and which ones are just like guarding the space. Um, and I did ask, um, part of the questioning was sort of like what each participant's background is in terms of their training and in terms of like what, you know, like what certifications do they have, like what sort of what models do they subscribe to. And it was very interesting that the the guides, the ones that are sort of, you know, like picking an activity and this is what we're doing and we're using the horse as a medium, um, they were more sort of like path trained, a lot of them, and a lot of sort of like the university led programs were more part of like what their background was, versus the people that were sort of like more like guarding the space. That is very Igala, right? So that was a lot of the people that sort of like either did like an Igala training or um, the sort of like little offshoot trainings that some of the trainers, you know, developed from that. So one of the things that I would love to look into is, you know, like do people have an understanding? Do they come in with this understanding of how they want to see the relationships in equine and they pick their training based on that? Or is that something that is sort of like imprinted during like the first few trainings that you do and you build your understanding based on that? So that would be interesting to look into. Um, and then one other thing that clearly came up, is that, you know, like I kept visualizing it as like a triangle, and that is so totally theoretical. Um, Almost no one works in a triangle, it seems. So a lot of counselors, I try to pick, or I try to have participants that would sort of like give me that like a like a triangle. Um, but most people work in teams. Most people work with like a lot of people work with groups, and rather than with individuals, a lot of people work with herds of horses. Um, and one of the things that was like really difficult in terms of how we can uh, in terms of how generalizable basically this kind of thinking or this kind of research would be, um, it really hinges a little bit on the fact that um, yeah, the triangle is fully theoretical and like the relationships that we have, it's not just three, but if you just add one more horse into it, like you know, like it's just exponential relationships, right? Like think about like a treatment team of like, let's say two people with like three horses and they see a family of four. Like how many individual relationships do you now have? Like a gazillion already. So that was for sure one of the limitations. Um, but I thought it was still very interesting because I still got like very clear answers, especially when it came to that distinction of like which of the relationships are even the most important, right? Like is it the relationship for the client with the counselor or is it the relationship for the client with the horse? And based on that, the therapeutic alliance was evaluated. Um, so I thought that was interesting. Um, Do we have any do we have any questions? I'm sorry, I feel like I kind of like almost like rushed a little bit through it.
Yeah, no, we don't have any in the chat right now, but I'm wondering like, who wants to I know the first question's always the hardest. Break the silence. You can actually, if you want, unmute and ask Sabrina if you have questions, or I'm happy to read off something if you want to put it in the chat.
If not, I mean, I would love to ask a question.
Go for it.
Um, I mean, it was so stark with like the participants in terms of like, like with the guides versus guards. I would love to know, if anything came up for you guys, like if you feel like you identify with one over the other a lot more, and how does that, like how did you guys feel like that developed in terms of like your training?
I'm happy to share my experience. I actually do both. It depends on the client, what the goals are. Um, yeah. And I really got both from my training. I'm in Australia, which you probably can hear. Um, and so all my training's been done here, which is neither path or a gala. Um, yeah. So I really do bounce between the two.
Also bounce between the two. We, for clients that come to us for equine-assisted coaching, we're more the coaching end than the counseling end. For those where we really have the ability to have that primary relationship between horse and human, where we kind of are allowing things to unfold a little bit more organically, that's the direction we go. But sometimes our clients might need a little bit more structure and might need a planned activity to help facilitate and help kind of jumpstart that interaction. So we also use uh, both modalities where needed. I am path as well as I went for most of my master's coursework in counseling, and then I'm also certified through EACA.
Yeah, interesting. Um, I I also feel like I've sort of like done like both ways. Um, and I think it really depends on sort of like what type of client you see as well.
How do you think, I think I have a question, like, how do you think this informs like new practitioners coming into the field, like in terms of how to approach sessions?
Yeah. Um, so I think it kind of has two implications. One was sort of like the result about like establishing a relationship sort of in like an asynchronous way. So I think one of the things that new practitioners should be really aware of is like their own relationship with the horse prior to, like trying to like get into this field. Um, and sort of like understanding that, like in order to build a therapeutic alliance, no matter if you see that between the client and you or between the client and the horse, um, that relationship between you and the horse is sort of like the the cornerstone that's like behind the scenes. Um, so that's one thing. And then the other thing is, um, like just having that awareness, I think, of which of these which of these modalities, like the guiding or the guarding, um, is sort of like makes the most sense for you and also for the kind of clients that you want to see, right? Like that's like you guys just said, like it kind of like depends on like what the client needs. And a lot of times, like I feel like certain client groups um, benefit more from one or the other paradigm. Um, So that would inform sort of like what kind of trainings you get, like if you want to work with like a specific group that like responds probably a lot better to, I don't know, like guiding the process because they just need a little more a little more of that. Um, that would inform sort of like what kind of trainings you should be signing up for example.
Hmm.
It's getting me thinking about my clientele and with, changing between guarding and guiding, who do I use? What diagnoses, what issues are they coming with? So which one am I using more? Yeah, fascinating. It'd also be really interesting to know the client's perspective. I would be fascinated in the client's perspective of that relationship between practitioner and equine, how deep that relationship runs, what effects that actually has on the therapy and what the client takes away from it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good. So basically similar questions, but instead of asking them to like the counselors, asking them to the clients, that would be very interesting. Yeah. I wonder how much they sort of like even notice, like this like behind the scenes kind of like relationship that there is.
Did you ask any specific questions about the therapist's relationship with the horses?
I kept it very general. I kind of asked like what they can tell me in general about their relationship to their horses. And um, it was very clear that that was like a priority for them to, like to have a good relationship. Like a lot of them like were like very proud of like, like their horsemanship skills and um, how close they were to their horses, and a lot of them really like said that that was like a vital part of um, picking the right horses for the right clients, keeping everybody safe and everybody sane in the in like in the session. Um, and that was, yeah, that was definitely a big part for most of them.
Interesting. Other questions? Sabrina, do you have other questions for the group while you have us here?
No, I mean, I kind of, Georgia, what you said, that was also like another sort of like follow-up question that I really have of like, like thinking about like the types of clients that, like we see and where do we use the guiding versus the guarding approach. And, is there specific like demographics or is there specific diagnoses? Or specific times during the treatment where like one clearly dominates over the other or is just like more useful. So that would also be really interesting, I think, to look at.
So what's next for you, Sabrina?
Um, Good question. Again, I have like I have more ideas around this topic in terms of research. But I'm also really, really busy right now with private practice. So um, I think the research aspect has to wait a little, unfortunately.
Well, it sounds like we might be interested in hearing where it goes if you ever find some time for it.
yeah. Well,
Well, thank you
Well,
guys so much for your questions.
does anybody else have any questions or comments? I think this is a lot of things to think about too.
Hmm. Qualitative research does, it kind of gives you these big ideas to go home and like sort through, and then you sit with your horse in the next session and you're like, oh, I do guard, or oh, I do that differently with the, it all comes like afterwards for me.
yeah. Yeah, I kind of expected that, especially in like for like a dissertation, because it's so like sort of like broad. You just like open this topic and it's like, okay, and now I have like 10 more questions that, that I
Hmm.
didn't have before.
Yeah.
That is what comes from qualitative interviews in general, right? From having the same thing going on with a study.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Sabrina, for sharing your information with us. And thanks everyone for joining us today. And again, let everyone know that we do free webinars, and so you could join us and or watch them on YouTube.
Or you could take a trip down to Florida in February and see us in person at our conference.
Yes, definitely.
And we did just get a comment from Betty Ann that said, oh, I lost it. Um, she's done 2 separate trainings, one in each model. Fascinating research. Thank you. So pretty cool.